Palouse Hills, Washington, October 1885. The wind came off the Snake River with a sharp, clean edge, carrying the scent of frost and dry bunch grass. On a low rise overlooking a sea of rolling, wheat-colored land, a man was doing something no one had ever seen before. The man was Owain Pritchard, late of Snowdonia, and the object of his attention was the derelict carcass of a 14-foot Studebaker sheep wagon. It sat not on wheels, but propped up on a rough cribwork of scavenged timber, looking like a beached ark. He wasn't fixing it. He was gutting it, then dressing it in a way that made the other men who passed on the track below stop and stare. He was stuffing its walls with wool. Not just any wool, but thick, greasy, compressed bats of it, forced between the wagon's iron ribs. Edmund Conklin, the district sheep buyer, pulled his horse to a halt, his face a mask of commercial skepticism. Conklin was a man who understood contracts, grazing rights, and the precise dollar value of a well-fleeced ewe. He did not understand this. With him were Jedediah Morse and Silas Croft, two ranchers whose opinions carried weight. "Pritchard," Conklin called out, his voice carrying easily on the thin air. "What in God's name is that?" Owain paused, a wooden peg in one hand, a mallet in the other. He looked down at them, his expression unreadable. "A house," he said, his Welsh accent clipping the word short. Morse let out a short, barking laugh. "A house made of wool? You'll be nesting with the mice and the rot by Christmas, man." Conklin's objection was more refined, more cutting because it was rooted in the law of the range. "That's an abandoned wagon, Pritchard. The 1880 Stock Grazing Act is clear. A wagon pulled off its running gear for a permanent dwelling on public land is considered abandonment. The district will have it broken for parts by April. You're building a home that will legally cease to exist in the spring." He smiled thinly. "You'd be wiser to build with sod. At least the government can't haul dirt away for scrap." Silas Croft, a man who had lost 2 children to a winter lung fever in a poorly chinked cabin, just shook his head slowly. "It's foolishness. A man can't live in a wagon through a Palouse winter. The iron frame will pull the very heat from your bones." He turned to Conklin. "The man's mad." Owain Pritchard offered no argument. He simply turned back to his work, picked up another dense bat of fleece, and began methodically packing it into the wall cavity. The rhythmic tap of his mallet against the wooden peg was the only answer he gave. What did this shepherd from the mountains of Snowdonia understand about thermal bridges and the hidden power of dense wool that the most experienced, most successful men on the Palouse had missed entirely? The answer to that question would not be found in legal acts or common wisdom, but in the brutal, unforgiving physics of a Washington winter. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn exactly how a forgotten shepherd's trick, born in the windswept fells of northern England, could turn a metal-framed box into a furnace of survival at 50 degrees below zero. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity, and let us know in the comments, what's the cleverest makeshift solution you've ever seen someone build? Owain Pritchard was not a carpenter. He had no gift for the complex joinery of a log cabin, the precise angles of a salt box roof. He was not a farmer, attuned to the subtleties of soil and seed. He was, to his core, a shepherd. His hands understood the heft of a well-balanced crook, the slick, greasy feel of a fresh-shorn fleece, the particular weight of a pregnant ewe. His memory was not of floor plans, but of fell land, the sponge of peat under his boots, the taste of wind-driven rain, the smell of a peat fire mixed with lanolin that clung to his clothes. He was a man whose knowledge was written in the behavior of sheep and the bite of the mountain wind. He had come from Caernarfon, where the mountains pressed down to the sea, bringing with him his wife Bronwyn and their 2 children, Rhys and Anwen. They had come for the promise of land, of a flock they could call their own on the vast open ranges of the American West. What they found was a landscape more brutal and alien than any Welsh mountain. Their first winter in the Palouse, spent in a hastily rented line shack, had nearly broken them. It was a cold that was different, a dry, piercing cold that seemed to find its way through every crack and pore. Owain remembered the small, terrible details of that winter with a clarity that still chilled him. He remembered the horsehair shaving brush left by the basin one morning, frozen solid in midair, its bristles fluffed into a dark, hard spike. He remembered Bronwyn bringing in the flannel shirts from the line, where they stood up on their own like sheets of colored tin, so stiff they could be snapped in two. The worst was the pump. The heavy iron handle, a simple, reliable machine, had betrayed them. The intense cold had caused the iron to contract at a different rate than the small brass set screw that held it in place. One morning, with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the frozen stillness, the screw popped out of its housing and rolled away, lost in the snow. The handle was useless. For 2 days, until a neighbor helped him fashion a replacement, they had to melt snow for water. A slow, fuel-hungry process that filled their tiny cabin with a damp, clinging chill. Rhys had developed a cough that rattled in his small chest for weeks. Anwen's hands were covered in chilblains. Owain had watched his family suffer in a shelter that was meant to protect them, and he swore it would never happen again. He didn't have the money for a proper cabin, nor the skills to build one quickly, but he had knowledge. He had the memory of the Pennine drovers, who wintered their shepherds on the high fells in wagons whose walls were packed tight with fleece, creating a warm, dry space against the howling gales. The conventional shelters of the Palouse sheep range were failing all around him. The problem wasn't a lack of effort or a shortage of wood. The problem was physics. The standard sheep wagon, a marvel of frontier mobility, became a death trap when stationary in winter. Its iron frame, the very thing that gave it strength, was a thermal bridge, a superhighway for heat to escape. The cold didn't have to seep through the thin wooden walls. It rode the iron ribs straight into the living space. Men would burn through a stack of wood, the stove glowing red hot, while frost formed on the nail heads just inches away, each one a tiny leak siphoning warmth out into the -30 air. Even the more permanent structures were flawed. The Fosters, neighbors 2 miles down the creek, had a log cabin, but it was built of green wood, and as the logs dried they shrank, opening up 100 tiny gaps for the wind to knife through. They spent their days chinking and re-chinking with mud and moss, a losing battle against the relentless infiltration of cold air. Their fuel consumption was astronomical. Abel Foster had confided in Owain that he'd burned through 7 cords of wood by February, and his wife still had to wear her coat to bed. The bachelors and single hands often lived in canvas tents or crude dugouts. The tents were a joke, offering privacy, but almost no thermal protection. Silas Croft had tried to winter in a heavy canvas wall tent and had woken one morning to find his water barrel frozen solid and his breath a cloud of ice crystals that fell like snow on his blanket. He abandoned it and moved into a crowded bunkhouse for the rest of the season. Dugouts were warmer, borrowing insulation from the earth itself, but they were damp, dark, and prone to a musty chill that settled deep in the lungs. Every one of these shelters failed because they misunderstood the enemy. They fought the cold with more fire, when the real enemy was heat loss. They were trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom by pouring water in faster. Owain knew you didn't need a bigger fire. You needed to patch the hole. His project began in the late summer, with the acquisition of the derelict Studebaker. It had been abandoned after a wheel shattered, its owner deeming it not worth the cost of repair. Owain traded 2 good ewes for it, a price that made his neighbors chuckle. He and Bronwyn, using levers and rollers and sheer persistence, moved the heavy wagon body onto a foundation of timber crib work, lifting it a foot off the ground to keep it away from the damp and the snow drifts. The work was methodical, almost ritualistic. First, he stripped the wagon down to its bare skeleton of wood and iron. He removed the rotten canvas top and the splintered interior planking. He stood for a long time just looking at the iron ribs, the very conduits of cold he intended to defeat. His first step was the inner skin. From a scrap pile behind the general store, he bought a stack of old, heavy iron stove tiles for pennies on the dollar. These were the thick, cast-iron plates used to protect wooden walls from the heat of a wood stove. He drilled and fastened them to the inside of the wagon's ribs, creating a solid, dark, metallic interior. It was slow, hard work, each tile heavy and awkward. Conklin rode by during this phase. "Lining your icebox with iron, Pritchard? You'll freeze faster than a side of beef." Owain just wiped sweat from his brow. "It holds the heat," he said, and went back to his drilling. Next came the heart of his design, the insulation. He didn't use the clean, valuable fleece from his own clip. He went to the shearing sheds and bought up bags of the lowest grade wool, belly clippings, stained tags, greasy discards that were barely worth shipping. This was the wool no one wanted, thick with lanolin. It was perfect. He and Bronwyn spent weeks carding and combing it, not to clean it, but to align its fibers before compressing it. They laid it out on a large canvas sheet, 4 inches thick, and then used a heavy wooden press of Owain's own design to squeeze it down into dense, stiff bats. The natural lanolin helped bind the fibers together. The result was a material that was surprisingly rigid, like a thick felt board. He cut these bats to fit perfectly between the iron ribs, leaving no gaps. He pegged them in place with small wooden dowels, creating a continuous 4-inch thick layer of insulation that covered every square inch of the walls and ceiling. The iron frame was completely buried within the fleece. The thermal bridge was severed. Bronwyn, watching him fit the last piece into the curved roof, put a hand on his arm. "It looks like a great woolly beast, Owain," she said, a smile in her voice. "A fat old ewe, warm and sleepy." For the outer skin, he used heavy oilcloth, the same waterproofed canvas used for sailors' slickers. He stretched it taut over the fleece-packed frame and nailed it down with hundreds of small tacks, each one sealed with a dab of pine tar. He overlapped every seam, ensuring it was as airtight and watertight as the hull of a ship. The final, crucial detail was the door. A door was the weakest point in any structure, a massive hole that was notoriously difficult to seal. Owain didn't just hang a door, he rebuilt the entire frame. He created a deep jamb with a double rabbet, allowing 2 separate seals. For the gaskets themselves, he used thick, industrial felt, the kind used for cushioning heavy machinery. He glued 1 strip of felt to the door and another to the jamb, so that when the door was closed and latched, the 2 gaskets compressed against each other, creating a nearly perfect, airtight seal. It closed not with a click, but with a soft, satisfying thump, like closing the door on a bank vault. The mockery continued throughout the autumn. The wagon was an oddity, a landmark of folly. Pritchard's Folly, they called it, the woolly box. Conklin made his legal pronouncements a regular feature of his visits to the area, reminding anyone who would listen that the structure was temporary, illegal, and would be dismantled come spring. Owain never argued, he just kept working. As the first snows began to fall, he installed a small, efficient sheep herder's stove inside, its pipe venting straight up through a carefully sealed metal collar in the roof. He moved his family in. The interior was strange, the walls of dark iron giving it the feel of a furnace chamber, but it was theirs. It was small, Barely 100 square feet for 4 people, but it was a fortress of wool. The science behind Owain's woolly fortress was as elegant as it was simple. The great failure of frontier construction was its ignorance of the thermal bridge. Heat doesn't just float through the air, it travels through solid materials, and some materials are far better conductors than others. Wood is a decent insulator, air is an even better one, but metal, iron in particular, is a superhighway for heat energy. A single iron bolt running from the inside of a cabin to the outside can suck more warmth from a room than a square foot of uninsulated wall. The iron frame of a standard sheep wagon was a skeleton of cold, conducting the brutal exterior temperatures directly to the thin inner skin, bypassing the wood or canvas walls entirely. No matter how hot the stove, the frame was constantly working to chill the interior air and every surface it touched. Owain Pritchard, through tradition rather than formal education, understood this implicitly. His entire design was a systematic attack on the thermal bridge. The first and most critical element was the 4 inches of compressed sheep fleece. Wool is a miracle of natural engineering. Each fiber has a natural crimp, a tiny sawtooth-like structure that traps air. A fluffy wool blanket works by trapping millions of tiny pockets of still air, which is an excellent insulator. But Owain wasn't just trapping air. He was creating a dense fibrous barrier. By compressing the wool into 4-inch bats, he created a material with an R value of approximately R4 per inch. His 4-inch wall had an R value of R16. For comparison, a standard 6-inch log wall from the period, depending on the wood and chinking, would have an R value between R8 and R10. Owain's thin-walled wagon was, thermally speaking, almost twice as effective as a log cabin. Crucially, this insulation completely encapsulated the iron frame, breaking the bridge. The iron was no longer connected to both the inside and outside. It was just a structural element buried deep inside a warm blanket. The second element was the inner skin of iron stove tiles. This was a stroke of genius that Conklin and the others mistook for madness. They saw iron and thought of cold. Owain saw iron and thought of thermal mass. The thick, heavy cast iron plates, isolated from the exterior by the fleece, did the opposite of the wagon's frame. They didn't conduct heat out, they absorbed it and held it. When the small stove was running, it radiated heat in all directions. The air warmed up quickly, but the iron tiles warmed up slowly, soaking up BTUs like a sponge. When the fire died down to coals overnight, the air would begin to cool, but the tiles would then begin to radiate their stored heat back into the small space, maintaining a stable temperature for hours. It was the same principle as a masonry heater, but on a miniature scale. The third piece was the outer skin of oilcloth. This served as a continuous, sealed air and vapor barrier. Much of the heat loss in a conventional cabin came from air leakage, drafts. The wind would force cold air in through 1,000 tiny cracks, while warm air escaped. Owain's oilcloth shell, with its tarred seams, was virtually airtight. No wind could penetrate it. It also prevented moisture from the outside from getting into the wool insulation, which would have ruined its effectiveness. Finally, there was the double felt gasket on the door. In a tiny, well-insulated space, the single largest point of failure is the entryway. Owain's meticulous door seal provided an R value of around R2.5, which seems small, but across the critical seam of the door, it was the difference between a drafty hatch and a sealed portal. His system was complete. He had defeated conduction with the fleece, managed radiation and thermal storage with the iron tiles, and stopped convection and air leakage with the oilcloth and felt gaskets. He hadn't just built a shelter, he had engineered a passive thermal envelope. That November, the weather turned. It began not with snow, but with rain. A strange, warm front rain that fell into a world already frozen. For 3 days, a steady, miserable drizzle coated every surface. Every branch, every blade of bunch grass, every fence wire was encased in a layer of clear, heavy ice. The ice grew thicker by the hour until it was an inch and a half deep, a crystal armor locking the landscape in its grip. The delicate beauty of it was a lie. The weight of the ice was immense. Cottonwood branches, unable to bear the load, cracked and fell with reports like rifle shots. Then, on the fourth day, the front passed, the sky cleared, and the temperature plunged. It dropped to 10 below zero by nightfall, then 20 below, then 30. For 9 consecutive nights, the official reading at the district office never rose above minus 34 degrees. The world was silent, brittle, and viciously cold. This was the winter test. In the Foster's log cabin, the ice-laden logs contracted, opening up new cracks. The moisture from their breathing and cooking froze instantly on the interior walls, coating them in a thick, white layer of rime frost. They burned wood constantly, living in a small bubble of heat around their stove, while the corners of the room remained at freezing temperatures. In the bunkhouses, men slept with everything they owned piled on top of them, their mustaches freezing to their blankets. The simple act of going outside was a risk, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Livestock suffered, huddling together for warmth, their coats frosted with ice. Several ranchers lost animals, frozen standing in the fields. Inside Pritchard's Folly, a different reality prevailed. The little sheep herder's stove put out a steady, gentle warmth. The iron-tiled walls absorbed the heat, radiating it back as a pleasant, even warmth that filled the small space. There were no drafts. The air was still and dry. The only sound from outside was the occasional deep groan of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of the ice. Bronwyn sat on a stool, mending one of Reese's socks. The needle in her hand was warm. Her fingers were nimble. In their old shack, any piece of metal left for a few minutes would become too cold to touch. Reese and Anwin were asleep on their small cots, covered by a single wool blanket each, breathing easily. They were not huddled, not shivering, just sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of warm children. The ultimate proof came from a simple, domestic ritual. Owain was a good shepherd. The brutal cold did not excuse him from his duties. In the middle of the night, he had to go out and check on his flock, especially the bellwether, to ensure they were safe in their sheltered coulee. Before he left, Bronwyn ladled a portion of caul, a thick Welsh stew of lamb and root vegetables, into a glass jar and placed it on a small shelf built against the iron-tiled inner wall, a few feet from the stove. Owain bundled himself in every layer he owned and stepped out into the night. The cold was a physical blow. It took his breath away. The door sealed behind him with its soft thump. He was gone for over an hour, his lantern a tiny, moving star in the vast, frozen darkness. When he returned, his beard and eyebrows were white with frost, his face numb. He stamped the snow from his boots and unlatched the door. A wave of still, dry warmth greeted him. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his skin stinging as the feeling returned. He walked over to the shelf. The jar of caul was not just unfrozen. It was not just warm. When he opened it, a small puff of steam rose into the air. He picked it up. The glass was hot to the touch. He ate his portion standing up, the hearty warmth of the stew spreading through him. In every other sheep camp across the Palouse, a shepherd's midnight meal was a brown, frozen jelly of a stew, carried in a saddlebag and thawed piece by piece in his mouth. Here, in the woolly wagon, it was a hot meal. The vindication, when it came, was not sought by Owain. It arrived by accident, carried on the back of the very weather that had proven his design. In early January, with the glaze of ice still thick upon the ground, Edmund Conklin sent one of his hands, a young man named Tom Garrett, to inspect Owain's early wool clip. Conklin was curious. Despite his public dismissals, about the condition of Pritchard's flock. Garrett set out in the buyer's heavy freight wagon, its iron-rimmed wheels struggling for purchase on the treacherous, icy track. He was halfway to Owain's camp when it happened. As the wagon crested a small rise, one of the wheels slipped into a frozen rut. The wagon lurched violently. There was a sharp, metallic crack. The wagon slumped sideways, its front axle dropping to the ground. Garrett climbed down to inspect the damage. The kingpin, the main pivot bolt that connected the front axle to the wagon's frame, had snapped clean in two under the strain. He was stranded miles from the nearest ranch with the temperature hovering at 20 below. He cursed, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Then he looked up and saw it. A thin, steady column of smoke rising from the strange, rounded shape on the nearby hill. Pritchard's Folly. With no other choice, he began the long, cold walk. He approached the wagon with low expectations. He expected to find a miserable, shivering family huddled around a stove in a smoke-filled, frosty box. He knocked on the solid-feeling door. When Owain opened it, Garrett braced himself for the familiar blast of cold, damp air that rushed out of every frontier dwelling. He expected to see walls coated in ice, the family bundled in coats. What he felt instead stopped him in his tracks. It was a wave of warmth, but not a scorching, dry heat from an overstoked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, still warmth. It hit his face, and the ice frozen in his beard and mustache began to melt and drip almost instantly. "Kingpin snapped on the buyer's wagon," Garrett mumbled, still processing the sensation. "Need to shelter. Maybe fashion a new one if you've a piece of iron." "Come in," Owain said simply, stepping aside. Garrett stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind him with that strange, soft thud. The silence was the first thing he noticed. The howling wind, a constant companion for weeks, was gone. The interior was dim, lit by a single lantern, the walls a dark metallic grid. The air smelled faintly of wool and cooking, not of wood smoke and damp. The Pritchard children were on the floor, playing with small wooden animals, wearing nothing but their shirt sleeves. He expected to feel cold radiating from the walls. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against one of the iron stove tiles. He was expecting a surface that would feel like a block of ice, one that would suck the heat from his hand. It was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch. He stood there for a full minute, his hand on the wall, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with a lifetime of experience. The small stove in the corner was burning, but only gently, its door shut tight. It couldn't possibly be producing this much heat. It was impossible. He was sweating. His heavy sheepskin coat, a vital piece of survival gear just moments before, was now suffocating. After 5 minutes of standing in the small, warm space while Owain found him a suitable iron rod, Garrett couldn't take it anymore. He shrugged out of the heavy coat and dropped it onto a bench. He stood there in his shirt sleeves, the same as the children on the floor, and just stared. Owain said nothing. He simply handed Garrett a bowl of the hot call. When Tom Garrett finally returned to the district office late that night, having fashioned a new pin and limped the wagon home, his report to Edmund Conklin was brief. He talked about the quality of Owain's fleece, the health of the flock. Then he paused. "Edmund," he said, his voice quiet, "that wagon of his, the woolly one." "What about it?" Conklin asked, not looking up from his ledger. "Still standing?" "It's warmer than your office," Garrett said. "Warmer than any cabin I've ever been in. I had to take my coat off. He's not burning half the wood the Fosters are." He looked at his boss. "You said that wagon would be broken for parts. You're wrong. Whatever he's done in there, it works." The men in the room fell silent. Conklin finally looked up, his pen still. The legal argument, the economic threat, all of it seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of Garrett's simple, sensory testimony. You didn't build a shelter, Owain. You built a lung that holds its breath against the cold. The story of Tom Garrett taking his coat off in Pritchard's Folly spread through the sheep camps like a winter grass fire. But respect on the frontier was one thing, adoption was another. The true spread of Owain's innovation came not from gossip, but from community. The following summer, at a large Welsh eisteddfod held in Pendleton, Oregon, a cultural gathering of music, poetry, and fellowship, Owain and his family were in attendance. He did not stand on a stage to lecture. He was approached quietly by other Welsh shepherds, men who, like him, had come from the old country and understood the unique properties of wool. The Davies brothers, who ran a flock near the John Day River, and the Jones family, with grazing rights up in the Wallawas, asked him directly. They had heard the stories. On the back of a piece of slate with a shard of chalk, Owain Pritchard sketched the design. He drew the iron ribs of the wagon. He drew the inner skin of stove tiles, explaining the concept of stored heat. He drew the thick, compressed bats of fleece, emphasizing the need to leave no gaps, to completely sever the thermal bridge. He showed them how to build the double-gasketed door. He spoke their language, a mixture of Welsh and English, of sheep and mountains. They understood. By the fall of 1886, 4 nearly identical wool-packed wagons had been built across the ranges of Washington and Oregon, their owners ready to face the winter with a new kind of confidence. What Owain Pritchard had created on that windy hill in the Palouse was, in essence, a high-performance micro-home. His intuitive, tradition-based understanding of heat transfer led him to solutions that modern building science would only codify a century later. His use of a continuous insulation layer to break the thermal bridge is a foundational principle of energy-efficient construction today. His iron tile interior was a brilliant, if unconventional, use of thermal mass to regulate temperature. His airtight oilcloth shell and sealed door anticipated the modern concept of the building envelope, the core of passive house design. He was a man with old-world knowledge solving a new-world problem, and in doing so, he leaped ahead of his time. The genius of Owain Pritchard was not that he invented something entirely new. His true insight was quieter, more profound. He looked at a piece of discarded industrial junk, a broken wagon, and saw not an end but a possibility. The frontier was a place of relentless consumption, of using things up and moving on. Cabins were built from freshly felled trees. Tools were bought new. Land was broken and exhausted. Owain's approach was different. It was one of conservation, of renewal. He didn't build a cabin from new logs. He taught a forgotten wagon to remember its first job, to shelter a shepherd from the storm. He gave it a new skin, a new heart of wool, and a new master who understood its hidden potential. The Palouse Hills didn't reward legal arguments or common wisdom. They rewarded what worked. And the warm, breathing, woolly wagon worked. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old technologies do you think hold forgotten lessons for us today? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.